Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Simon Rose of Save Our Savers. Simon Rose, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you very much indeed, Max.
Simon Rose, people are talking about Cyprus and the Nicosian beheading, not just the haircut or the chop, but the beheading. Now, you point out here at the Save Our Savers campaign that in the UK, they've suffered a 20% decapitation of their money. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, we simply looked at how much savers were getting on average before base rates were cut to their record low of 0.5%, and we looked at what they've had in the 3 years since it was cut. And the actual loss to savers has been about £100 billion. But of course, inflation has been much higher than expected as well. And the difference between inflation and what you're actually getting for your savings on your cash accounts for another 120. So in total, £220 billion has been lost by UK savers in 4 years alone in this country. And given that we got a total, sorry, numbers just trip off the tongue, 1.1 trillion, but essentially it is 20% of the entire value of savings has just gone, never to be recovered in the last 4 years. So why is the UK press getting so worked up about what happens in Cyprus when they don't seem to give a monkeys about what happens in the UK? It's ridiculous.
I think you bring up a few points there. First of all, this £220 billion figure, put into context here, those who are arguing that the 0.5% rate that is being on offer from the Bank of England, essentially, is helping people pay their mortgages. It's been calculated recently that mortgage payers are saving approximately £70 billion. What you're saying is that simultaneously the economy is losing 3 times that amount of money in lost income from the coercion of interest rates, the forcing down of interest rates in an unnatural way from the normalized rate of 4 or 5% down to this 0.5%. And so for every pound, essentially, that George Osborne is gifting to the City of London, he's stealing 3 from the other 65 million British people who are now suffering as a result of this calculation, this calculated destruction of an economy by George Osborne on behalf of a few speculators and bankers.
It's decapitalizing the country. I mean,
it's decapitalizing.
So how can you have capitalism in any form without capital? It's crazy.
Let's riff on this decapitalization theme for a second, because there's the Tower of London where they perform decapitations.
Yeah, well, hang on. The Tower of London in our background, what people got killed for was high treason. What was one of the crimes for high treason? Debasing the currency. What else have they been doing but debasing the currency? Now, what people used to be sentenced to was you didn't get tortured, you didn't get quartered, but you got hung and drawn to your place of execution and then hung, or burned if you're a woman and you debase the currency. But that is exactly what they have done.
So what we're saying is if George Osborne were alive a couple 100 years ago, 300 years ago, he would be roped, tied around each of his extremities, his arms and legs, attached to horses, and they would gallop off in opposite directions, and he would be torn asunder, then burned, then hung, then spit on, then killed.
Why do I suddenly feel a lot happier? Sadly, that doesn't appear to be the case these days.
So this is an economic problem, but it's a problem also of jurisprudence. In other words, the standards of justice in this country have collapsed because here's a treasonous no-goodnik that's being allowed to sashay around in the House of Commons stealing money.
But it isn't just him. It's everybody. We've got the bankers, we've got the government, you've got the opposition. No, there are hardly any MPs at all who seem to understand what is going on. Very, very few that we can.
But he stood up in front of the group of workers with their reflective jackets on, just poured it over from the Crosswell project, and he started talking about why these workers are important. He speaketh with forked tongue.
Oh, not only that, but the latest thing is that people have discovered he's been adopting estuary English, which is sort of white van man way of talking.
Right,
which
like
is quite extraordinary.
He's taking his accent down to, Guy Ritchie will sound like one of the blokes, isn't he? Yeah. Not a posh little, so same thing with George, right? He likes to adjust the accent just so to make it appear.
Doesn't matter.
It's like George Bush used to sound purposely stupid, because in America, if you sound like George Bush stupid, that means you're somehow honest. So here you have George Osborne going from the posh accent to, some more Cockney on the scale to sound real.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what he does. I'm still not going to want to have a drink down the pub with him.
All right, let's move on because.
But I mean, you know, the whole of this easy money thing is just it's becoming absolutely extraordinary. And of course, the one group that benefits most is the government. So no wonder George Osborne's doing nothing about it. You go back to 2009, he was giving speeches about how the Conservatives were going to help save us. I mean, the promises they made were quite extraordinary. The moment they get into power, of course, they just forget it.
Now, the economy, of course, is what about this idea of, he brought forward, of cutting the minimum wage? Because, interestingly enough, in the Telegraph, which is considered to be more, right-wing, there was a story, I forget who, possibly Jeremy Warner, was arguing in favor that actually minimum wage should be raised.
Yeah.
So here's another. Now, first of all, if the left wing out there were smart, they would jump all over that. But of course, none of them read the Telegraph, so they didn't even know that this right wing guy was arguing for a higher minimum wage. But what are your thoughts on that?
The trouble is, I can see both sides of the argument.
Right.
I read Jeremy Warner's piece, and it seemed very reasonable and well argued. But at the same time, I've read Hazlitt. I understand the libertarian view, and there's the worry that the people you're actually damaging by having a minimum wage are the people who are being stopped from getting jobs because employers simply can't afford it.
Yeah, but here's my point. If you're going to keep a central bank that's forcing interest rates down while at the same time flooding the money supply out there so the corporations and banks' balance sheets are exploding, in other words, bankers and politicians essentially are paid on the growth of money supply, whereas labor tends to be paid on something tied to inflation, which is tied to the consumer price index. Why not tie minimum wage to money supply and say, see what I'm saying? In other words, if they're going to have a central bank that's manipulating interest rates, then workers should have some skin in the game, and their salary, their wage should be tied in the same way to money supply. Or conversely, get rid of the central bank and have a free market.
Oh,
right?
Wonderful.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
But you can't have a situation where it's a giveaway, a gift, George Osborne gifting money to the city and then penalizing workers at the same time.
Okay, Max, what you say is absolute common sense, but when was the last time we heard common sense coming out of number 11 Downing Street or any politician's mouth? The problem is they will not admit to what they're doing. They will not admit how they are debasing the currency. They will not admit even to the true inflation numbers. I mean, we've worked these out on official inflation figures, which in the last 5 years we've had inflation of about 17% on our RPI or CPI index. But there's a city firm called Tullett-Prebon who are the thorn in the side of most economists because they actually look at the real picture.
What's the
and
name?
they've taken
Tullett-Prebon. Who?
Tullett-Prebon. Very good firm.
What kind of name is that? Tullett-Prebon?
I don't know why they got that name, but they have two very good guys.
Why can't it be like a more American, like Joe's Data?
Joe's Data.
Joe's
Data.
It's
not going to work
Why
over
does it
here.
have to be all
Not going to work
this
over
fancy
here.
freaking
Anyway,
Tullett Slim Nip Knockin' Bomb.
They are called Tullett-Prebon, and they're not going to change the name just for you.
Okay.
And their economist, Tim Morgan, calculated how much the prices of essentials have gone up. Because many people, particularly Save Our Savers members, there are things they have to spend money on. Food, energy, these sort of things.
Right.
Now, 17% is an index encompassing all goods, including things like iPads. Not all pensioners are going to be able to afford an iPad.
Okay, so what's the real rate
The
of
real
inflation?
rate of inflation over the 5 years is not 17%, but 33%. But if you actually look at the economic figures and take that figure of 33% in the last few years, well, it's not just the economy's been stagnant, it's been going backwards very, very quickly.
Right, so the government says the inflation is roughly 2.8%.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so based on what you just said, it's doubled that number.
Yeah, at the moment it's not very much higher, but certainly over the last few years, yes, it has been significantly higher.
So when people have this sensation at the end of the month that they're not able to buy as much as they did the month before on stuff that they actually need, like food, energy, things like this, they're correct.
Yes, and even on the official figures, in real terms, incomes in the UK, much like in America, are back to where they were about 10 years ago. So no wonder most people are feeling poor, unless they're the beneficiary of things like QE, and they're working in the city, or they're a politician.
What's the breaking point? At what point do you have like a poll tax right? At what point do you have people saying, you know what, you've lied to me about inflation, you've lied to me about your objectives in QE, you've stolen 20% of the country's GDP, you've feathered the nest of financial terrorists without any legal recourse whatsoever. I've had it, that's it, I'm going to revolt. Where are we in the cycle?
In England, I suspect the breaking point is much later than everywhere else. When we used to have fantastic revolts. In the days when they put people in that place behind there.
How insulting is it for the government to give people 1p off a beer while at the same time giving the City of London billions and billions of...
But that was the headline, and that's what many people will notice.
Yeah.
And they won't understand what's happening to the money supply.
But isn't that a bit insulting? They're treating the public
yeah.
like monkeys? Like, here's a banana, you freaking monkey. The zookeeper's taking all the real money. I mean, isn't that insulting? I mean, the zookeeper, George Osborne...
Are you expressing surprise here that politicians are
Well, I'm just surprised people put up with that. I mean, they're like, oh, a pee off a pint of beer, I'm so happy. But they're treating you like a freaking monkey in a zoo, you bozo.
Well, the reason, of course, is because they make it sound so complicated when actually it's very simple. They are debasing our money. It is worth less all the time. And that is why everybody, not just savers, is feeling poorer. And then on top of all that, you get the situation in Cyprus, which is made even worse by Dieselblue, or whatever his name is, saying, well, you know, actually, we might just take your money whenever we decide we're going to in future. So suddenly savers who have been losing money through inflation being higher than interest rates are now saying to themselves, if they've got any common sense, hang on, I thought saving cash deposit was a risk-free thing to do. Well, if it doesn't have a risk, why on earth are you going to do it for 1% at a time when you might have 40% or more of your money suddenly confiscated?
Okay, let me repeat the big point here, and that is that people who are upset about Cyprus have to realize that in the UK, they've already had their Cyprus.
I mean, almost every Western nation. No, right. They had their Cyprus. It's still going on, and it's getting worse.
It's getting worse.
I mean, our last budget has just done exactly the same thing as before. We have a debt crisis here. As you always point out, our debt is between 5 and 9 times. We take everything together, 5 and 9 times our annual income.
That's right.
We owe.
That's right.
Death to all economists who say, oh, it doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. Well, I mean, this is still going on. It's getting worse. And in our last budget, we're in this mess because of debt.
There's 30% that comes from overseas, and at some point they'll pull the plug.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got all this debt, and what does he do in the budget? He tries to get people to take on more debt.
Yeah, well,
because as you pointed out, it works so well in America, trying to encourage people who can't afford to buy houses to have a way of buying them.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was a failure. So why is Osborne repeating that failed policy as if it's going to magically, undergo some Harry Potter-like transformation?
The why I don't know. I think they expected a few years ago that things would just somehow magically get better and their rabbit would be pulled out of the hat.
Well, I mean,
it's not going to happen.
We know why. Because for 40 or 50 years, even though debt has expanded every single decade, there have been periods of growth.
Yes.
Where growth has exceeded debt rate of increase. But but it is a bit of a Ponzi scheme. And in 2007, 2008, the music stopped. And for 5 years now, no matter what they do, there's no growth.
Yeah.
The growth rate is going rapidly in reverse. And no matter how much money they print, no matter how much debt they inject, there's not any growth above the amount of debt that's growing. Now, I think we have about a minute left. Let me just touch briefly on Mark Carney, who's coming in to run the Bank of England.
Smarmy Carney.
Smarmy Carney.
Yeah.
Okay. You heard it here first. Any thoughts? We've got about 20 seconds on what might be we expect.
Well, from a saver's point of view, I imagine he's going to try and push inflation up even higher. But that's no answer at all.
Will he dump Osborne? I think he's brought in.
Sadly, the governor of the Bank of England is not able to choose the chancellor.
I think he's going to work behind the scenes. He's going to get rid of Osborne. He's got the regulatory purview now, so he's accumulating power. He's a power-mad psycho. Ex-hockey player that got hit in the head with a hockey puck too many times.
It'll be interesting. It won't be good news for savers, unfortunately. But as to when, we talked about this before, when are people's breaking point going to be reached? I really don't know. But
well, we've already reached it on this show. All right. Simon Rose of Save Our Savers, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Simon Rose of Save Our Savers, the most important group now operating in this entire frickin' country. If you'd like to contact me, please send a tweet. You find me there. Or perhaps you'd send an email to kaiserreport@rttv.ru. Are you prepared for the truth? Bye, y'all.